Frank's throat constricted, but his voice emerged steady. I've worked with a lot of people in the industry. Grief doesn't discriminate by zip code. The late afternoon light slanted through the Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across Stallone's weathered face. At 73, the actor carried himself like a man still fighting invisible opponents, shoulders set in permanent defense. The baseball cap now rested on his knee. A Cardinals hat, Frank noted, remembering Stallone's St. Louis roots from the research he'd done 3 decades ago. That's not what I meant. Stallone's eyes never left Frank's face. You ever do stunt coordination? Back in the day? Frank reached for his water glass, buying time. The motion was deliberate, controlled, a technique he'd taught countless clients for managing anxiety. Funny how his own methods felt like thin ice now. I've had various roles in Hollywood over the years, Frank said. But we're here to talk about your loss. In your intake form, you mentioned struggling with public comments about your son Sage. Stallone's jaw tightened at the name. Good. Deflection through pain, another counselor's trick. Make them feel something stronger than suspicion. Some comedian made jokes about Sage being gone. Stallone's voice dropped to a whisper. 30 years in this business, I've heard every insult. But that, he shook his head, that broke something in me I didn't know could still break. Frank leaned forward, slipping into the therapeutic persona that had become second nature. When public figures mock our private pain, it can feel like a violation of the sacred space we've created around our grief. Sacred space. Stallone tested the words. Yeah, that's exactly it. For a moment, Frank almost forgot who was sitting across from him. This wasn't the action hero who dominated box offices, or the man whose life Frank had systematically destroyed. This was just another grieving father, carrying a wound that would never fully heal. Frank knew that wound intimately. Danny's face flashed in his mind, 24 years old, standing at the base of that cliff in Yosemite, adjusting the climbing gear Frank had inspected. The gear Frank had approved, the gear that failed because Frank had been hungover, careless, rushing through safety checks to get back to his trailer and the bottle hidden inside. Tell me about Sage, Frank said softly. Stallone's shoulders dropped. He was brilliant. Not just smart, brilliant. Wanted to direct, write. Had this vision for films that meant something, you know? Not just explosions and one-liners. A bitter smile crossed his lips, better than his old man ever was. You speak about him in past tense, but you also speak about his dreams as if they were still alive. Because they should be. He was only 36. Should have had 40 more years to prove the world wrong about nepotism, about riding his father's coattails. Instead, Stallone's hands clenched. Instead, some jackass in a comedy club gets laughs talking about my dead son. Frank nodded, making notes he didn't need. His memory had always been perfect for details that mattered, like the exact angle needed to weaken a support cable without making it obvious, like the precise pressure point that would cause catastrophic failure during a high-fall stunt sequence. How long ago did Sage pass? 7 years. Heart attack. Stallone's voice cracked. Found him in his apartment. Prescription drugs in his system, but he wasn't using. The coroner said it was atherosclerotic heart disease, genetic, nothing anyone could have done. Frank wrote survivor's guilt in his notepad, though he could have diagnosed it from across the room. Do you blame yourself? Every day. The honesty hit Frank like a physical blow. 7 years of carrying that guilt. Frank had carried his for 15. Some days it felt lighter, most days it felt like it was calcifying in his chest, becoming part of his skeleton. The comedian who made the jokes, Frank said. What specifically triggered your need to seek help now? Stallone was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire room. He said Sage killed himself because he couldn't live up to being Rocky's son. Said the real tragedy was that Rocky could take a beating but couldn't raise a kid who could. Frank's pen stopped moving. That must have been devastating. I wanted to kill him. The words came out flat, matter of fact. Not movie violence, real violence. I could see myself doing it, step by step. That scared the hell out of me. Frank understood. The same rage had consumed him after Danny died, rage at the equipment manufacturers, the safety inspectors, everyone except the person actually responsible. It had taken years to turn that rage inward where it belonged. What stopped you? Stallone looked directly at him then, and Frank saw something flicker behind his eyes. Knowledge, calculation. I remembered something someone told me once, about revenge, how it's a dish best served cold. Frank's blood turned to ice water, but his training held. That's an interesting perspective. Can you elaborate on what that means to you? Stallone smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. Means sometimes the best revenge is letting the other person destroy themselves. Patience, waiting for the right moment. The session had 19 minutes remaining, but Frank suddenly felt like time was running out entirely. Frank's hand remained steady as he continued writing, though every instinct screamed at him to run. The afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across his office walls lined with certificates and commendations that suddenly felt like elaborate props in a theater he no longer controlled. That's a complex philosophy, Frank said, his voice carrying the same measured tone he'd perfected over 15 years of sessions. Can you help me understand what the right moment means to you? But Stallone had gone quiet, his gaze drifting to the photographs on Frank's desk. The silver frames caught the dying sunlight. Danny at 17, grinning beside his climbing gear at Joshua Tree. Frank with his ex-wife Margaret at some long-forgotten industry party, both of them young and stupidly happy. A more recent photo of Frank's grief counseling certification ceremony, where he'd stood surrounded by colleagues who believed in his redemption. Nice family photos, Stallone said, though his tone suggested the comment wasn't casual. Your son? The question landed like a blow to the solar plexus. Frank nodded, not trusting his voice. Looks like he was into climbing. Stallone leaned forward slightly, studying Danny's face with an intensity that made Frank's skin crawl. Dangerous hobby, lots of variables, equipment failure, human error, acts of God. Each word felt deliberately chosen, weighted with meaning beyond its surface. Frank's mouth had gone dry, but he forced himself to respond. Yes, Danny loved the mountains. We lost him in an accident 8 years ago. 8 years. Stallone repeated the number as if testing it. That's rough. Right around the time you started doing grief counseling, I imagine? Frank's pen had stopped moving entirely. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken knowledge. Through the office windows, he could hear the distant sound of traffic on Pacific Coast Highway, the normal world continuing its oblivious rotation while his carefully constructed life began to crack at the foundations. Sometimes our greatest wounds become our greatest gifts, Frank said, falling back on therapeutic platitudes because the truth was too dangerous. Helping others process loss has been healing. Stallone's smile was sharp as a blade. Healing. That's beautiful, really. Takes real strength to turn pain into purpose. He paused, picking up the Cardinals cap and turning it over in his hands. Takes even more strength to carry guilt for 15 years and still function, still help people, still look at yourself in the mirror every morning. The number hit Frank like a physical blow. 15 years, not 8 when Danny died. 15 when Frank had sabotaged Stallone's stunt career, destroying a man's livelihood with the same carelessness that would later kill his own son. I'm not sure I follow, Frank said, though they both knew he was lying. Course you don't, Stallone stood, moving to the window. His reflection in the glass looked ghostly, translucent. You know what I learned during all those months in physical therapy? After my back got destroyed in that accident, I learned patience, real patience. Not the movie kind where the hero broods for 5 minutes before getting revenge, the kind where you spend decades putting pieces together. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs, but his training held. Years of maintaining composure in front of grieving clients, of being the steady presence in their emotional storms, served him now. It sounds like you've done significant work processing trauma. That's commendable. Stallone turned from the window, and for a moment his expression softened. You're good at this, you know. The counseling thing. I can see why people trust you. Hell, I trust you, and I came here planning to... He stopped, shaking his head. Funny how sitting in this chair changes things. The admission carried weight beyond its words. Frank glimpsed something vulnerable beneath Stallone's calculating exterior. Genuine pain, genuine need, the same raw grief he'd seen in hundreds of clients' faces. It complicated everything. "What were you planning to do?" Frank asked quietly. Stallone was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I spent 3 years tracking down everyone involved in that stunt sequence. Prop masters, safety coordinators, riggers. Wanted to understand how equipment just randomly fails on a routine scene. You'd be amazed what people remember when you ask the right questions." The session clock read 12 minutes remaining. 12 minutes to navigate a minefield that had been planted 3 decades ago. Frank thought of Margaret, who still called occasionally to check on him, of his current clients who depended on his stability, of the quiet life he'd built from the wreckage of his guilt. "And what did you discover?" Frank heard himself ask. Stallone smiled again, but this time it carried sadness instead of menace. "That's what's funny about revenge. You plan it for so long, you forget that the person you're hunting might have already destroyed himself more thoroughly than you ever could." The words hung in the air between them as the Malibu sunset painted the office walls gold, and Frank realized that neither of them was quite who they'd planned to be when this session began. Frank felt the weight of 30 years pressing against his chest as Stallone's words settled into the silence. The golden light from the sunset seemed to mock them both. Two broken men circling truths that could destroy what little they'd managed to rebuild. "Sometimes the hunting changes the hunter," Frank said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking as a therapist or confessing something deeper. Stallone's laugh was bitter. "You should know." The session clock showed 8 minutes remaining, but time had become elastic, unreliable. Frank's carefully maintained professional distance was crumbling with each passing second. He thought of the morning's routine: coffee, meditation, reviewing client files with the same detached compassion he'd cultivated like armor. Now that armor was disintegrating. "I think we should," Frank began, but Stallone held up a hand. "Before we finish dancing around this, there's something you need to see." Stallone reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a manila envelope, yellowed with age. The motion was deliberate, almost ceremonial. "Found this in my safety deposit box last week. Been carrying it around, trying to decide if I had the balls to actually show it to you." Frank's throat constricted. "I don't think. Just look at it." The envelope landed on the coffee table between them, with a soft thud that somehow felt deafening. Frank stared at it as if it might explode. His name was written across the front in handwriting he didn't recognize, but the postmark made his blood turn to ice. Los Angeles, dated 3 days after the stunt accident that had ended Stallone's career. "Where did you get this?" Frank's voice was barely a whisper. "Anonymous delivery. Showed up at my hospital room while I was learning to walk again." Stallone's eyes never left Frank's face. "Go ahead, open it." Frank's hands trembled as he lifted the envelope. The paper felt fragile, ancient. Inside were 3 items: a photograph, a handwritten letter, and what looked like technical specifications for rigging equipment. The photograph showed Frank's younger self examining a cable assembly, his face clearly visible in profile. Someone had circled his hands with red ink. The letter was worse. Frank recognized the handwriting now. Billy Kowalski, one of the riggers who'd been fired after the accident. The words were shaky, desperate. "Mr. Stallone, I can't live with this anymore. Frank Torino knew that cable was compromised. I told him during the safety check. He was hung over, said it would hold for 1 take. When you fell, he blamed the equipment manufacturer. I kept quiet because I needed the work, but I can't sleep anymore. The enclosed photo and specs prove he approved faulty rigging. I'm sorry I waited so long to tell the truth. B. Kowalski." Frank's vision blurred. The technical specifications showed stress calculations in his own handwriting, numbers that proved he'd known the cable was operating beyond safe parameters. Evidence of the negligence that had destroyed an innocent man's career, preserved like a time bomb for 3 decades. "Billy killed himself 6 months after writing that letter," Stallone said softly. "Guilt ate him alive. You want to know something funny? I was so doped up on painkillers when this arrived, I stuffed it in a box and forgot about it for years. By the time I found it again, I'd already rebuilt my life, made peace with the disability, started thinking maybe the accident was just bad luck. Frank couldn't speak. The words on the page seemed to pulse with accusation. Every client he'd helped, every moment of peace he'd found, every small act of redemption, all of it built on a foundation of lies. But then Sage died, Stallone continued, his voice growing harder. And during those dark months afterward, I remembered this letter. Started thinking about justice, about how some people get to reinvent themselves, while others carry the consequences forever. The office felt smaller now, the walls pressing inward. Frank thought of Danny's face, bright with excitement as they'd planned their climbing trip. The cosmic justice of it was suffocating. The man whose carelessness had destroyed Stallone's body, watching his own son die from the same negligent impulse. Why now? Frank managed to ask. Why not just turn this over to the police years ago? Stallone studied him with something that might have been pity. Because revenge isn't about justice, Frank. It's about making the other person understand what they took from you. Prison would have been too easy, too clean. He gestured around the office. But this? Watching you build something beautiful out of your guilt, knowing I could destroy it with one phone call, that felt like proper payment. The sunset was fading, leaving the office in gathering shadows. Frank realized he was still holding the damning photograph, his younger self preserved in a moment of criminal negligence. The man in that picture was a stranger now, or perhaps Frank himself was the stranger, built from guilt and good intentions over the grave of his authentic self. So what happens now? Frank whispered. Stallone stood, replacing his Cardinals cap with practiced precision. Now we see if either of us has learned anything about redemption. He left the envelope on the table and walked toward the door, leaving Frank alone with the evidence of his sins and the terrible understanding that his old life had just ended forever. Frank sat motionless in the gathering darkness, staring at the evidence scattered across his coffee table like the remnants of a bomb blast. The photograph of his younger self seemed to mock him from beneath the amber glow of his desk lamp, the only light he could bring himself to turn on after Stallone's departure. His phone buzzed. Margaret's name appeared on the screen, but he couldn't make himself answer. What would he tell her? That the careful reconstruction of their relationship over the past 5 years, the tentative dinners, the shared memories of Danny, the gradual forgiveness, was about to crumble again. That the man she'd learned to respect as a grief counselor was the same reckless fool who'd destroyed their marriage through negligence and lies? The buzzing stopped, then immediately started again. This time it was Dr. Patricia Reeves, his supervisor at the Grief Counseling Center. Frank's stomach lurched as he remembered their standing Tuesday morning meeting. How could he sit across from her desk tomorrow, discussing client care protocols and therapeutic boundaries, when his entire practice was built on deception? He let that call go to voicemail too. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Frank tried to stand, to move, to do anything that might break the spell of paralysis, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. Every breath felt deliberate, forced. The meditation techniques he taught his clients, ground yourself, notice 5 things you can see, 4 you can hear, felt like cruel jokes now. His landline rang, the old-fashioned bell cutting through the quiet like an alarm. Frank's hand hovered over the receiver, but something in the aggressive persistence of the ringing made him hesitate. On the 7th ring, his answering machine clicked on. "Frank, it's Mike Castellano. Listen, I need you to call me back tonight. Something's come up about that article I mentioned last week. The Times piece about Hollywood stunt safety. They're asking specific questions about incidents from the 80s and 90s. Your name came up. Call me." The machine clicked off, leaving Frank staring at it in horror. Mike Castellano, his former assistant coordinator, now running his own stunt company. The article about Hollywood safety protocols that Mike had mentioned casually the week before, laughing about how the old days were like the Wild West. Frank had barely paid attention then, secure in the assumption that the past was buried. His phone buzzed with a text message. Frank tried calling. "Need to talk urgently, not something for voicemail." "Mike." Frank's hands shook as he scrolled through his recent messages, seeing them with new eyes. 3 texts from industry colleagues over the past week, all mentioning the Times investigation. A missed call from someone named Jennifer Walsh, who'd left a voicemail identifying herself as an investigative reporter. He'd deleted it without listening, assuming it was about his current work. The walls of his office seemed to be closing in. Frank forced himself to stand, walking to the window where Stallone had stood an hour earlier. The Pacific Coast Highway stretched below, red taillights streaming like blood cells through the arteries of a city that was suddenly foreign to him. His reflection in the glass looked haggard, older than his 72 years. Behind him, the framed certificates and awards that documented his second career as a healer seemed to watch accusingly. The California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists license, the grief counseling certification, the Community Service Award from the Malibu Crisis Center, all of it meaningless now. Frank's phone rang again. This time the number was blocked, but he found himself answering without thinking. "Mr. Torino, this is Jennifer Walsh from the Los Angeles Times. I apologize for calling so late, but I'm working on a story about safety violations in the film industry, and I'd like to ask you some questions about your time as a stunt coordinator." The reporter's voice was calm, professional, but Frank could hear the hunger beneath it, the scent of a story that could make careers. He hung up without speaking, but the damage was done. She knew where to find him. Within minutes, his phone was buzzing with notifications. An email from the Grief Counseling Center's executive director, marked urgent. A text from his Wednesday morning client asking to reschedule due to concerns about recent media attention. Another blocked number calling, then another. Frank turned off his phone and sank back into his chair, but the damage was spreading beyond his ability to contain it. Somewhere in Los Angeles, reporters were connecting dots he'd spent 15 years keeping separate. Colleagues were whispering about investigations and asking uncomfortable questions. The carefully constructed world where Frank Torino the healer existed independently from Frank Torino the destroyer was collapsing with the inexorable momentum of a controlled demolition. The photograph of Danny seemed to blur as Frank stared at it, his son's young face dissolving into the memory of another young man, Stallone, confident and powerful before Frank's negligence had stolen his future. The cosmic justice was perfect in its cruelty, both their sons lost to the same careless impulse. 30 years apart. Outside, the Malibu night pressed against his windows like a living thing, and Frank finally understood that Stallone's revenge had never required confession or confrontation. It only required patience, and the terrible weight of truth finding its own way to the surface. Frank sat frozen in his chair as the night deepened around him, the weight of 30 years pressing down like a physical force. The evidence of his crimes lay scattered across the coffee table, Billy Kowalski's trembling handwriting seeming to move in the lamplight, the photograph of his younger self frozen in an act of criminal negligence that had destroyed an innocent man's future. But it was the silence that terrified him most. The complete absence of his phone's buzzing, the calls that had stopped coming after he'd turned off the device. In his 15 years as a grief counselor, Frank had learned that silence often preceded the worst revelations. Clients went quiet just before confessing the unbearable truths that had brought them to his office. Now he was experiencing that terrible hush from the other side. He tried to stand, but his legs betrayed him. The meditation techniques he taught others, ground yourself in the present moment, notice your breathing, felt like mockeries now. There was no present moment for Frank anymore, only the past reaching forward to reclaim him, and a future that was dissolving with each passing second. The landline rang again, its shrill bell cutting through the darkness. Frank stared at it, knowing he should answer, knowing that ignoring it would only make things worse, but his hand wouldn't move. On the 5th ring, the machine clicked on again. "Frank, it's Dr. Reeves. I just got off the phone with the Times reporter. We need to discuss your status at the center immediately. There are allegations. Please call me tonight regardless of the hour." The clinical distance in Patricia's voice, the same tone she used when discussing client terminations, made Frank's chest constrict. Patricia Reeves had hired him 5 years ago, had believed in his transformation from broken man to healer. She defended his unconventional background to the board, arguing that his personal experience with loss made him uniquely qualified to help others. Now that trust was evaporating in real time. Frank forced himself to his feet, walking to the window where Stallone had stood hours earlier. The view that usually calmed him, The Pacific, stretching endlessly toward the horizon, now seemed like a vast emptiness that mirrored the hollowness growing inside him. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass and tried to remember the man he'd been before tonight. The careful, compassionate professional who'd guided hundreds of people through their darkest moments. That man felt like a stranger now. His reflection stared back from the window, and Frank saw something that made his breath catch. Behind his own ghostly image, the framed photograph of Danny had fallen over on his desk, lying flat as if his son was sleeping. The sight triggered a memory so vivid it felt like physical pain. Danny's face on the hospital pillow after the climbing accident. The machines keeping him alive while Frank bargained with a god he'd never believed in. The cosmic justice was overwhelming. Frank's negligence had destroyed Stallone's body, stolen his career, left him broken and struggling to rebuild. 15 years later, that same careless impulse had killed Frank's own son, the universe balancing its books with mathematical precision. Both men had lost everything to Frank's inability to prioritize safety over convenience, to choose caution over the easy path. But where Stallone had found the strength to transform his suffering into purpose, Frank had hidden behind good works and therapeutic degrees, building a new identity from the wreckage of his guilt without ever truly confronting what he'd done. The landline rang a third time. Frank turned from the window, staring at the machine as if it were a snake preparing to strike. This time the caller didn't wait for the beep. "I know you're there, Frank." It was Stallone's voice, calm and certain in the darkness. "Saw your office light from the road. We need to finish our conversation." Frank's hand trembled as he reached for the receiver. "I thought you'd said everything you came to say." That was before I understood something. Stallone's voice carried a weight that hadn't been there during their session. "You know what I realized driving away from your office? I spent 30 years planning to destroy you, but you'd already done the work for me. The guilt, the self-hatred, the way you've built your whole life around trying to earn forgiveness for something unforgivable. You're already in prison, Frank. You just decorated your cell so beautifully that you forgot you were locked up." The words hit Frank like physical blows. He sank into his chair, the phone pressed to his ear, listening to his own damnation delivered with therapeutic precision. "Oh, here's what's going to happen," Stallone continued. "Tomorrow morning, you're going to call that reporter back. You're going to tell her everything. About Billy Kowalski, about the cable you knew was compromised, about the 30 years you've spent hiding behind other people's grief. Not because I'm forcing you to, but because it's the only way either of us ever gets free." The line went dead, leaving Frank alone in the darkness with the sound of his own ragged breathing and the terrible understanding that redemption might require destroying everything he'd become. Frank sat in the darkness for a long time after Stallone's ultimatum, the dead phone still pressed against his ear. Outside, Malibu's wealthy silence stretched endlessly. No sirens, no traffic, just the distant whisper of waves against rocks far below. The kind of peace that money could buy, that guilt could appreciate, that lies could preserve. But something was wrong with the quiet. Frank's 15 years of grief counseling had taught him to read silences, to understand the spaces between words where truth lived. And this silence felt different, artificial, like the held breath before a revelation that would change everything. He turned his phone back on, watching the screen flood with notifications. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages. But as he scrolled through them, a pattern emerged that made his chest tighten with a new kind of fear. The first few messages were what he'd expected. Colleagues asking about the Times investigation, clients canceling sessions, Dr. Reeves demanding immediate contact. But mixed among them were texts from numbers he didn't recognize, all saying variations of the same thing: "Saw the news. So sorry for your loss." Loss? What loss? Frank's hands shook as he opened his laptop, searching for his own name in recent news. The results made the room spin around him. 3 hours ago, while he'd been sitting in darkness contemplating Stallone's ultimatum, someone had leaked more than just the stunt accident story. The headline on Variety made him physically sick. Grief counselor's secret past. Industry veteran hid role in fatal stunt accident that inspired son's death obsession. Frank read the article with growing horror. Someone had given them everything. Not just Billy Kowalski's letter, but details about Danny's death that only a few people knew. The climbing accident. Frank's negligence in checking the safety equipment. The parallel between father's carelessness destroying Stallone's career and the same impulse killing his own child 15 years later. But the worst revelation was buried in the article's final paragraphs. A quote from an unnamed source who knew intimate details about Frank's relationship with his son. Danny Torino had become obsessed with his father's past in the months before his death. He'd been researching the Stallone accident, trying to understand how someone could be so careless with another person's safety. Friends say he'd planned to confront his father about the cover-up during their climbing trip. The irony is devastating. The son died trying to understand the father's negligence, killed by that same negligence in the end. Frank's vision blurred. Danny had known. His son had spent his final months investigating, questioning, probably wrestling with the same moral horror that was eating Frank alive now. The climbing trip hadn't been a bonding experience. It had been Danny's attempt to create a space for the most difficult conversation of both their lives. A conversation that Frank's hungover carelessness had made impossible forever. The phone rang, jolting Frank from his paralysis. Margaret's name appeared on the screen, and this time he answered without thinking. "Frank." Her voice was hollow, exhausted. "I just saw the article. Tell me it's not true. Tell me our son didn't die because you were too proud to admit you'd been drinking again." "Margaret, 30 years, Frank. 30 years I thought you'd learned something from destroying that man's career. 30 years I believed you when you said it was equipment failure, when you swore you'd followed every safety protocol." Her voice broke. "Danny knew, didn't he? He figured it out, and he was going to make you face it, and you killed him rather than have that conversation. I didn't mean for him to—" Frank's words collapsed into themselves, inadequate and pathetic. "You didn't mean for him to what? To learn the truth about his father? To demand accountability? To make you be honest for once in your miserable life?" Margaret's grief had crystallized into something harder than anger. "You know what the worst part is? I spent 15 years thinking his death brought out something good in you. The counseling, the helping other people. I thought maybe Danny's sacrifice had meaning. But it was all just another lie, wasn't it? Another way to avoid facing what you really are." Frank tried to speak, but Margaret wasn't finished. "Stallone's people leaked this, didn't they? They've been planning this for years, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy you completely. And you know what, Frank? You deserved it. You deserved all of it." The line went dead. Frank stared at the phone, understanding with terrible clarity that Stallone's revenge had never been about confession or confrontation. It had been about exposure, about letting Frank build something beautiful from his guilt, then showing the world exactly what that beauty was built on. The ultimate truth wasn't that Frank had killed Danny through negligence. It was that Danny had died trying to save his father's soul, and Frank hadn't even known he needed saving. Frank sat in the wreckage of his exposed life, Margaret's words echoing in the darkness like a death sentence. The laptop screen glowed accusingly, the Variety article still open, its headline a monument to 30 years of carefully constructed lies. But as the initial shock began to fade, something else took its place. A cold, analytical clarity that reminded him of the man he'd been before grief had reshaped him into something softer. Stallone's revenge was masterful in its patience, but it had one flaw. It assumed Frank would crumble under the weight of exposure, that he would retreat into the same paralyzed guilt that had driven him to become a counselor in the first place. But Margaret's accusation, that Danny had died trying to save his father's soul, had awakened something Frank thought he'd buried decades ago. The survival instinct of a man who had once navigated Hollywood's deadliest politics. Frank closed the laptop and walked to his filing cabinet, retrieving a folder he hadn't opened in 15 years. Inside were documents from Danny's accident investigation, police reports, equipment analysis, witness statements. But tucked behind them was something else. A manila envelope containing photographs and documents that Danny had been collecting in the months before his death. Frank spread them across his desk with steady hands. Danny's research was thorough, obsessive, the work of a young man who had inherited his father's attention to detail. Newspaper clippings about the Stallone accident, interviews with crew members, and most damaging of all, financial records showing payments Frank had made to Billy Kowalski over the years. Small amounts, irregular timing, but consistent enough to suggest ongoing compensation for silence. His son had built an airtight case against him, piece by piece, preparing for a confrontation that would have destroyed them both. But there was something else in the file that Frank had missed in his initial grief-stricken review, a letter addressed to Margaret, sealed but never sent. Frank's hands trembled as he opened it, reading Danny's careful handwriting by lamplight. "Mom, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me before I could have the conversation I've been planning with Dad. I've discovered something about the accident that ended the actor's career, and I think Dad has been carrying this guilt alone for too long. I'm not trying to destroy our family, but I can't watch him destroy himself anymore. The drinking, the nightmares, the way he flinches when people call him a hero for his counseling work, it's all connected to what happened 30 years ago. Maybe if we can face this together, we can finally heal. Tell Dad I love him, and that some secrets are too heavy for one person to carry alone. Danny." Frank read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of his son's compassion. Danny hadn't been planning an accusation. He'd been attempting an intervention. The climbing trip was meant to be a safe space for confession, forgiveness, and the kind of healing Frank had spent 15 years helping others achieve. Instead, Frank's negligence had silenced the one person who might have saved him. The landline rang again, but this time Frank answered on the first ring, his voice steady. "Stallone. You sound different." There was surprise in the actor's voice, perhaps disappointment that his carefully orchestrated revelation hadn't achieved the complete destruction he'd planned. "I found my son's research files." Frank kept his tone conversational, professional. Impressive work. Danny would have made a good investigator, but he missed something crucial in his analysis. "What are you talking about?" Billy Kowalski wasn't the only witness to our conversation about the cable. There was a second rigger present, Marcus Webb. He's been dead for 12 years, but before he died, he gave a very different account of events to his son, an account that suggests you knew about the cable issues too, but chose to proceed because the shot was behind schedule and over budget. The silence stretched between them, and Frank smiled grimly. He was lying, of course. There had been no second witness, no contradictory account. But Stallone's hesitation suggested Frank had struck something close to truth. "You're bluffing," Stallone said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe. But ask yourself this. After 30 years of planning this revenge, are you willing to bet everything on maybe? Because I just realized something important about my situation. I'm a 72-year-old man with nothing left to lose. My wife hates me, my career is over, my son is dead, and my carefully constructed second life just got exposed to the world. Do you know what that makes me?" Frank paused, letting the question hang in the darkness. "Dangerous," he continued. "Because when you have nothing left to protect, you can afford to tell the whole truth. Not just my part, but everyone's part, including yours." Frank hung up before Stallone could respond, understanding with crystalline clarity that the game had just entered its final phase. The question now wasn't whether the truth would destroy him. It was whether he could control enough of the narrative to take his enemies down with him. Outside, dawn was beginning to touch the Pacific horizon, and Frank realized he was no longer afraid. Frank stared at the phone for 30 seconds after hanging up, watching the dawn light creep across his office walls. The silence that followed felt different from the crushing weight of earlier, cleaner somehow, like the air after a violent storm has finally passed through. Then his phone exploded. The first call came within minutes, Stallone's number flashing on the screen. Frank declined it. The second call came from a blocked number. Then another. Within 10 minutes, his phone was ringing continuously, the sound sharp and insistent in the growing daylight. Frank turned the ringer off and walked to his window, looking out at the Pacific as it caught the first golden rays of sunrise. The beauty of the moment struck him as obscene. How dare the world continue its ancient rhythms while his carefully constructed life collapsed into rubble? A soft knock at his office door made him turn. Through the frosted glass, he could see a familiar silhouette that made his chest tighten with a different kind of dread. "Dr. Torino?" The voice belonged to Sarah Chen, his Tuesday afternoon regular, a 34-year-old teacher whose daughter had died in a car accident 2 years ago. "I know it's early, but I saw your light. I read the article." Frank closed his eyes. Of course she had. By now, every client at the grief center would know. Every person he'd guided through their darkest moments would be questioning whether his compassion had been genuine or just another layer of his elaborate deception. He opened the door, and Sarah's face confirmed his worst fears. Her eyes held the particular kind of hurt that comes from discovering a trusted healer is wounded in ways they never admitted. But underneath the betrayal was something else, a recognition that frightened him more than her anger would have. "You knew," she said simply. "When I talked about the guilt, about feeling responsible for Emma's death because I was the one who insisted we take that route home, you knew exactly what I was feeling because you were living with the same thing." Frank nodded slowly. There was no point in denial anymore. "Does that make everything we worked through together meaningless?" Sarah's voice was smaller now, vulnerable in the way that had made their sessions so powerful. "Were you just using my grief to process your own?" The question hung between them like a blade. Frank found himself thinking of Danny's letter, his son's belief that some secrets were too heavy for one person to carry alone. Perhaps this moment, this terrible, necessary reckoning, was the conversation Danny had been trying to create 15 years ago. "No," Frank said finally. "It makes everything we worked through more meaningful, because I understood your guilt from the inside. I knew how it could consume you, twist everything good in your life into something poisonous. I helped you find forgiveness for yourself because I was desperate to believe that forgiveness was possible." Sarah studied his face in the harsh morning light streaming through the windows. "Did you find it, I mean?" "No." The admission came easier than Frank had expected. "I built a career around helping others heal from wounds I couldn't acknowledge in myself. I was a fraud, Sarah. A well-intentioned fraud, maybe, but a fraud nonetheless. What about now, after everything's been exposed?" Frank considered the question seriously, surprised to find himself genuinely uncertain of the answer. "I don't know. For the first time in 30 years, I honestly don't know what comes next." Sarah nodded slowly, and Frank saw something shift in her expression, a softening that he didn't deserve but desperately needed. "Emma used to say that broken things could still be beautiful," she said quietly. "That sometimes the cracks were what let the light in. I never understood what she meant until after she died. Maybe this is your crack, Dr. Torino. Maybe this is when the light finally gets in." She left him standing in the doorway, her words echoing in the empty hallway. Frank returned to his desk and picked up Danny's letter, reading his son's final words again. "Some secrets are too heavy for one person to carry alone." His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at the pier. We finish this now. Stallone." Frank looked around his office one last time, at the degrees on the wall that would soon be revoked, at the family photos that told a story he was finally ready to complete, at the comfortable furniture where he'd helped hundreds of people confront truths they'd been avoiding. Danny had been right about secrets and their weight, but Sarah was right too. Sometimes the breaking point was where healing finally became possible. Frank picked up his keys and walked toward the door, understanding with perfect clarity that the man who returned from the pier would be someone entirely different from the one leaving. If anyone returned at all, the game was ending, but for the first time since it began, Frank couldn't predict the winner. Resolution. The pier stretched into the Pacific like a wooden finger pointing toward absolution, its weathered planks slick with morning mist. Frank walked its length slowly, his footsteps echoing in the salt air, each step carrying him further from the man he'd been and closer to whatever he was becoming. Stallone waited at the pier's end, silhouetted against the rising sun. He looked smaller than he had in Frank's office, diminished somehow, as if the act of finally springing his 30-year trap had drained something essential from him. The actor turned as Frank approached, his face carrying the hollow satisfaction of a man who had achieved his revenge, only to discover it tasted like ash. "You came," Stallone said. "Did you think I wouldn't?" They stood facing each other across the wooden railing, two old men carrying decades of mutual destruction between them like a diseased inheritance. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, indifferent to their human complications. "I expected you to run," Stallone admitted, "or lawyer up, fight the exposure, deny everything, try to salvage whatever pieces you could." Frank shook his head. "I'm tired of running from what I am. Danny figured that out before I did. He died trying to teach me something I was too proud to learn. Your son was a good kid, I had people watching you for years. I know what kind of man he was becoming." Stallone's voice carried an unexpected gentleness. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry he got caught in the crossfire." "He wasn't caught in anything. He was trying to save me from myself." Frank gripped the railing, feeling the ocean spray on his face. "The question is, what now? You've exposed me, destroyed my career, probably ended any chance I had of reconciling with my wife. Is that enough, or do you need blood?" Stallone was quiet for a long moment, studying Frank's face as if searching for something he'd lost track of during their long war. "I spent 30 years planning your destruction. I imagined this moment 10,000 times, you broken, begging, finally understanding what you'd taken from me. But standing here now, it feels empty," Frank finished. "Revenge always does. That's something else my son tried to teach me." "How do you know what Danny tried to teach you? You told me yourself you never had the conversation." Frank pulled Danny's unsent letter from his pocket, the paper soft with repeated handling. "He left instructions, in case something happened, before he could save me from my own guilt." He handed the letter to Stallone. "Read it." Stallone's hands shook slightly as he unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning Danny's careful words. Frank watched the actor's expression change, saw the moment when the reality of Danny's love penetrated 30 years of accumulated hatred. "Jesus," Stallone whispered, "he was trying to help you find peace, and I killed him for it. Not intentionally, but just as surely as if I'd pushed him off that cliff myself." Frank's voice was steady now, purged of the desperate edge that had characterized their earlier confrontations. "So tell me, does knowing that make your revenge sweeter or more bitter?" Stallone folded the letter carefully, his movements deliberate and slow. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight Frank hadn't heard before. "I had a son too, you know, before the accident. Sarah and I, we'd been trying for years. She was finally pregnant when my career ended, when the pain pills and depression took over, the stress, the financial pressure, the constant physical agony. It was too much for her. She lost the baby and left me the same week." Frank felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the defensive walls he'd maintained throughout their conflict. "You never told me that during our sessions. Because this was never about therapy for me. It was about positioning myself to destroy you at the moment when you had the most to lose." Stallone's smile was bitter but somehow cleaner than before. "But your son's letter changes things. He saw what I couldn't, that carrying this poison was killing us both. So where does that leave us?" Stallone handed the letter back, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "I don't know. For 30 years, everything I did was focused on this moment. I never planned for what came after." Frank tucked Danny's letter back into his pocket, feeling its weight differently now. Not as evidence of his failure, but as proof of love that had transcended death itself. Danny wrote that some secrets are too heavy for one person to carry alone. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe some secrets are too heavy for two people as well. "You think we should tell the whole truth? Everything?" "I think we should stop carrying it at all." Frank looked out at the endless Pacific, feeling something like peace touch the edges of his consciousness for the first time in decades. The truth is already out there. Our careers are over, our reputations destroyed. But we're still alive, and that means we still have choices to make about who we want to be in whatever time we have left. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the coastline in sharp relief. Two old men stood at the end of a pier, their shared destruction finally complete, their futures uncertain but somehow, impossibly, full of possibility.